Honest J. Nowak. Oh yeah. A pleasure to meet y'all at last, and welcome back to Honest J. Nowak, Mark of the Line. And let's also get down to the fact that, well, if you're very familiar with what I talked about yesterday, I basically covered how the economic recession of 2007 and 2009 had apparently wiped out a lot of automotive companies out there in the industry. And now there's a handful of them that are pretty much history. Yesterday I talked about how Pontiac became a big legend within just a couple decades, and then of course it eventually faded out by the end of the 2000s. But here, let's get on to another one, very similar to that, except this came from the same parent company that also created Lincoln, Mercury. Yep. The Ford Motor Company itself had basically created at least a few subsidiaries, Lincoln and Mercury, just to name a few. Lincoln, of course, was pretty much similar to that of Toyota's own Lexus, being a more luxurious type of manufacturer out there. In terms of Mercury, it tends to be similar to Lincoln, but it also tends to take some design cues and aspects out of Ford itself. So it tends to be sort of a hybrid between luxury, style, and performance at the same time. But judging by what we've gotten based on, well, the last few decades, based on how Mercury sales had also begun to decline during the 90s and 2000s, it's probably no wonder why it's yet another big example of an automotive manufacturer that was not only killed off by GM during the recession, but it was also one of those that happened to be failing mostly because of some specific things that also took place. So, the thing is, it's now time to go ahead and tackle on a bit of history behind the company of Mercury itself. Obviously, Mercury was named after the planet, which of course was named after a historical figure in mythology. So, that's a bit of a thread right there. But then again, we also have the element of Mercury. It probably could have been named after that too. But the thing is, Mercury Motors itself is a bit of a different story when you compare it to Lincoln or Pontiac or many other brands of its time. It of course managed to last a pretty long time as well, but then of course we came through the recession. And that of course was what forced GM to shut down several companies that it owned throughout the past few generations. And Mercury was sadly one of those. Although it did manage to last slightly longer than that of Pontiac, becoming defunct in 2011. Not even a year after Pontiac's closure in general. But the thing about Mercury when it comes to dealing with the kind of past that it had, it was a bit average for its time period. Mercury, of course, happened to become known throughout the 30s, 40s, and 50s, particularly for some models out there that not many people were very familiar with. Because, of course, a couple models that pretty much dominated the world market during the 40s and 50s would pretty much include the Ford Super Deluxe, Chevrolet Corvette, and Bel Air, and then of course there were some others that also begun to take the line. Although the Mercury Sun Valley from the 1940s was probably a good example of how the past pretty much started to come out to be when the present would eventually allow Mercury to start gaining extra profits. And eventually to what Ford would start getting once it had acquired the brand itself at some point eventually. Just like it had managed to do with Lincoln, Ford did try to do a lot of big things to Mercury in order to make it bigger and better over time. And throughout the 50s, that's practically what it managed to do. But the big thing about Mercury, in terms of how it managed to grow even bigger, was of course the 1960s. There were actually a few other models that had begun to surface, including the Comet, Colony Park, and even the Turnpike, just to name a few. Mercury, of course, started having new models added to its repertoire, and Ford started getting some new ideas in order to make Mercury's catalog of models out there much more bigger overnight. By the 1970s, though, was when they had pretty much come up with a rather impressive muscle car that practically dominated the world market at the time. The Cougar. Yeah. The Mercury Cougar was, in fact, one of the greatest muscle cars that had ever come out. Aside from the Chevrolet Camaro, Ford Mustang, and Gran Torino, as well as the Buick Grand Sports X, and several others, the Mercury Cougar really made a great contender to that of many of its own brethren of muscle cars from the 60s and 70s. It continued to make some really good sales out there too, even going into the 80s, which was pretty much a big dread when it came to most muscle cars designed from that exact era. Of course, you remember how big of a travesty it was to reintroduce the Dodge Charger during that exact era. And then, of course, the Pontiac Firebird, although it managed to thrive pretty well, it was not necessarily as good as its older counterparts. And then, of course, you could probably remember the Chevrolet Camaro and Ford Mustang being redesigned in several different ways. But that's not to say that the 80s were pretty much the worst possible time to reintroduce some of these classic models that have been well known for their time. Mercury, of course, did in fact turn out to be a bit better in some ways. And that's mostly because of how big of the sales based on the Cougar itself managed to get. Though there were, of course, a bunch of other models that came around during the 70s and 80s, and then leading up to the 90s with such models like the Tracer and, well, of course, you're probably familiar with some other models from the 90s, like the Mystique, the Marauder, and then, of course, there eventually came along a new generation of the Cougar in the 2000s. Mercury, of course, happened to thrive pretty well throughout that time, until then, of course, sales started to decline, as usual, with many brands that somehow managed to survive the 90s and 2000s. An economic crash took place. In 2007, up until maybe 2009, was when the world had entered probably one of the worst possible events to ever take place in modern day history. The recession. And man, oh man, did it do so much damage to the automotive industry that General Motors was forced to take out a few of its own companies, subsidiaries and branches of all sorts, just so they don't have to worry about losing a lot of its own potential profits. Sadly, out of all marques that currently existed in GM's lineup, Mercury was another example that ended up being taken out by GM. They assassinated the crap out of Mercury, just like they did with Hummer and Pontiac and some others pretty much, only because Mercury was not performing as good as it used to. It may have introduced a lot of great things back in the past, but in the future, it did not do so well. And that's what eventually led to General Motors being forced to, well, take it out. Pretty much. It's yet another big memory in our lives that we probably will never be able to let go. Specifically because it was a great company back in the day. And then, of course, you could probably only imagine what Mercury would have been like if it were still around today. I probably couldn't do so well, but you know what? It's probably all up to you. At this point, though, we could probably just focus on some other companies out there that are still thriving pretty well, somehow. But until that happens, if you want to see more go down on my channel, then make sure that you like, subscribe, comment, follow me on social media, and stay on the Hollywood side.